G'day, I'm Mel James from James Buy Sell, and today we're going to be talking about what's happening in the Melbourne top end market, particularly the spring quarter, September 2025. Well, I can tell you it's quite volatile, and I'll show you why. But particularly what we want to talk about is what is going on with quoting. There's a house. Let's talk about how it might be quoted, how it might be thought about. Well, there's the seller, and that's what they think their house is worth. And then there's the buyer. Maybe there's buyers, and that's what they think the house is worth. That is a universal situation. How do you bring these two together? You bring these two together through an agent, and specifically how they present, how they quote, what they actually do in terms of the methods. So, there's the seller, and there are the buyers. There are two ways you can be bringing these two together. It's through like an auction process where the agents are quoting such where they're trying to get multiple buyers to push up to the seller's price. Then there's the other way, which is basically the seller asks for their price, here's the buyers, and tries to reach down and grab a buyer and take them up to their particular price. Basically in Melbourne, I think you'll probably find that 5 million is the differential point. This particular way of grabbing a buyer and taking them up, usually when there's only one buyer, is usually for the top end of the market, and that's usually in an EOI. On this side of the market, this is usually in the 1 to 2 million sort of range, and people are trying to quote to attract and then push the buyers up. That's what happens in Melbourne. Well, that's the theory anyway. That's the theory of what should go on. But plenty of times when there are pass-ins, that is because they've been quoting down here, but the buyers have not pushed the price to up here. They should have done this particular method of grabbing one buyer and taking them back up. Similarly, we have a lot of problems with what we call about underquoting, is because most of the buyers think that this is actually what the seller is trying to achieve, when really the seller is trying to achieve there. And have you ever met a seller who doesn't want there? Of course they want there. And you have a pass-in when there's a disconnect, when there's the seller is there and the buyers are here. It's the agent's job during the campaign to bring these two together. Let's have a look at the 3 deals over the weekend, or 2 deals and 1 non-deal over the weekend that we were involved in, or not, we weren't involved in, that we monitored, so you can see how the selling and the buying and the quoting actually works. Okay, let's get rid of this. So the 3 properties we're going to talk about were Clifton Hill, which we bid on and lost, Bona Vista, number 1 Bona Vista in Surrey Hills, which went miles over the reserve, and then also Love Street in Camberwell. Now, O'Grady Street in Clifton Hill, we were bidding on, in fact I was bidding on this one today, and what basically the quote was 155 to 165, and it sold for 2 million. How did that work? Well, the advice we gave before was basically up to 1.9 seemed fair and reasonable value, so the quote we felt was very conservative. And basically 2 million was possible with really strong bidding. And it was a volcano, so it basically went like this. Had a heap of interest, and you could tell there were many other people at the auction who wanted to bid. They didn't get a chance to bid, and with competitive pressures, the price was forced up. I actually thought we were probably going to be the winner at 196, which is effectively our last bid, but we were trumped at the last minute by somebody at 2 million. I mean, it still hurts. I hate losing, but that's the way the cookie crumbles. Now in Bona Vista, and you can see these on the websites, on what I actually thought about this property. Both this one and Love Street in Camberwell, they're both spec homes. Now this was quoting 2.9 to 3.1 when I went through a couple of weeks ago. And look, it's a 25-year-old home, but basically it had something about it. And also James Tostovan is a skilled sort of quoter and auction negotiator. Anyway, obviously the plan was this. The plan was to create a lot of interest here and push the price up. Did they do that illegally, immorally, whatever? Well, I don't actually think they did, because the property was basically on the market here. So this was market forces pushing the market, pushing all that interest up. And there was 5 bidders. It was a volcano, and off the top of my head, it was what, 3.8 something it actually sold for. So that's an auction doing its job, pushing the price up. Have a look at the other one on Love Street. Now this is a fairly new property, but to me I actually like this property better than this one. And they're quoting $1 million more than what this one is quoting. Their thought process, well, I think their thought process was initially a volcano. But after a while they found that, well, really what their asking price, and they wanted sort of, well, currently now after a failed auction, they're after, what, close enough to 4.3. Their quote at one stage was up around here, then they dropped the quote. But I don't think it was a sincere drop, and you could feel that in the video. I went there before the auction, and basically I think they were trying to grab somebody and then take them back up there. But what actually happened was there was nobody interested in the property. I mean, at this level, at this price level, and that's where it's at. That's what we need to come back and talk about, which we will in a sec. It's all very well to have these thoughts up here as a seller, but if the market's down here and doesn't share your views, well then it's no sale. This is how that sort of coming together at auctions or even EOIs or any form of negotiation works. There's the buyers there, there's the sellers there, always, and if they don't reach some form of agreement, if that doesn't happen, then there is no sale. And in times of difficult markets, excuse me, this is what you see. You see all the sellers up here, and you see all the buyers down here. And that is what is called a stagnant market. But that's not the market that we are currently in September 2025. The market we are in now is like this. What that means, there's some deals happening up here and there's some no deals happening down here. That is because there's a lot of differences between what buyers think and what sellers think. We are actually in a changing market. We are in a market that is going up. This also happens when the market's going down, but that's not what is happening. And you can see that the market is going up, creating this volatility in September 2025. So how can you cause, or how can you create a situation where there's nowhere near as much angst between the seller and between the buyers? Because we all like a bargain. If you're not talking about coming along, sale and all this sort of stuff, you are not going to get the buyers. And that's what you need to do. You must attract the buyers. Then you must engage with the buyers before you can close with the buyers. So how do you attract? You attract by actually how you quote, how you present, how you market the property. And then how do you engage? Well, I believe you engage best in this sort of market by what I call step quoting. And I think the best way to talk about step quoting and how it can actually work, because it's perfectly legal and it's actually what should happen in a moving market. How do you do this? Well, I think the best way to explain this is through the 5 properties that we have just sale managed in the last week. So these are 5 properties that we have been the seller advocate on in the last week. Eltham, or they've closed in the last week, meaning they've sold. Glen Iris, Kew, Albert Park and Canterbury. And they range from 1.2 million to over 15 million. And in 4 of the 5 cases, we used what we call step quoting, or what I call step quoting. So that basically means that you start here, you then lift the quote if the market allows you to do that and if you want to, until you get to where the seller actually is, or the other way of step quoting is the seller goes to where the buyers are, or somewhere in between. Let's talk about how that actually happened here. With Eltham, the client wanted 1.2, always wanted 1.2. This was about 6 months ago. Basically, for most of the first 6 months, especially during winter, they basically had offers up to $1,050,000. Now, brought the quote down to $1,050,000 to 1.15, because look, at the end of the day, they would have accepted $1,050,000 if they absolutely had to. This is in recent times, but they still would like 1.2, but they would accept $1,050,000 if it happened. Anyway, the quote came down, and basically the interest started to build along with the market. This is just in recent times, and there were 3 offers, and eventually the top offer at 1.2. There is nothing wrong with what happened there. In Glen Iris, as we say in the video, have a look at the videos where we've talked about what has been our role. So we started quoting at 2.9 to 3.1. Basically, why did we do that? Well, did the seller want up here? No. Well, if the seller wanted up here and that's all they would take, then that's illegal. Basically, they wanted to sell. We had 3 agents come through, and they basically said 2.7, 2.8 to 2.9. And so initially we quoted 2.7 to 2.9. The interest came in. We then lifted it to 2.9 to 3.1 to reflect the interest, and definitely the reserve would have been within there, but it sold before auction for 3.2. That was creating the interest and getting the people to go there, and perfectly legitimately, because at the end of the day, the client, would have accepted this, our original quote, if that's all that would have happened. They had an open mind in the first week. Kew was a property that sold for over 15 million. We ran an EOI campaign and we quoted 15. We didn't quote any range. We didn't quote 15 to 16.5 because, again, spoke to the seller and said, what are you trying to achieve? And the seller said, well, what I'm trying to achieve, Mal, is a sale. So with good agent work, that's where we felt, with good agent work in our own minds, we felt 15 million was achievable. So we put it out at the market at 15 million, and there was 4 bidders. 2 were below 15 million, 1 was at 15 million, and 1 was above 15 million, and obviously the one above won. Now, we didn't do any step quoting during that process. We maintained 15 million all the way through, and it sold for just over 15 million. Albert Park. This property also sold this week. And this was really important because this was part of we'd already bought for these particular clients. We'd had a couple of agents through, and the general view was, to use an agent term, the general view was circle 3. So we opened with an initial quote of 2.7 to 2.9 with the view to try and create, well, first of all, we started off market and that didn't quite work. So we then went on market to try and get a volcano to push people up like that. But we started with 20 groups through, but people were not saying, well, they were not engaging. Second week, things changed a lot. There was some engagement and we started to have some repeat visitors. So we lifted the quote to 2.9 to 3.1. Again, trying to sort of show people where we felt things were at. And definitely our seller would have had to have taken that, would have. But by the second week was keener to hear, and this was more a reflection of also where we thought buyers were. And basically we had some pre-auction offers and it was sold above that range. Canterbury, here's a good example. This property went for, well, this was property took us a year to sell. And basically the seller was there, and probably in fairness to the seller, on a bit of advice that we gave, meaning agents that we'd organised, but we gave that advice 18 months ago and the market has since dropped, but the seller's expectations hadn't dropped. And so we went through a process here of basically all over the shop until eventually we found a number that would been consistent all the way through and sold. And there was two people that actually, in the end, a little mini sort of situation was created and it sold above the actual quote now, but below one of the other quotes that originally happened. In the end, the deal was done. Let's talk about one other situation here. This was at a property that I was sale managing in Rosny Street in Hawthorn. It was a little single fronter, beautiful. It was earlier in the year. We had a heap of interest, like stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks of buyers. Where was our seller? Was our seller up here? No, our seller just wanted to sell. So we were initially quoting 1.3 to 1.4. And all the advice was that quote was too low and everybody was prepared to pay more than that. And we had worked out or identified what we thought was 6 buyers, in other words, a volcano. So we lifted it to 1.4 to 1.5. However, by the time we came to auction, none of these 6, not one of these 6 bid. And somebody who turned up on the day bid, offered it within that range, and it was sold within that range. And I think that's what you'll find quite a few agents, in some ways, of course there's a lot of underquoting there. But there's also a number of, all of us at various times have been burnt, and we do like to keep the quotes, well, not so much conservative, but you certainly don't like to be overquoting. Nobody, not one seller will thank you. And this is where, in quoting, a lot of people do not understand. Buyers have rights, but sellers also have rights. If you're quoting up here, and you think you're quoting where the seller actually wants to be and that's in the seller's best interests, well, what usually happens is sellers have all the bravado at the start of a campaign, but by the end of the campaign, they work out, well, you can have all the bravado you like, but if you don't sell the property, mission is unachieved. So they tend to go down here in the face of information. So it's probably better to quote here in the first place, where you can encourage the seller to have an open mind. If the seller doesn't have an open mind, you have to quote here. That's the law. It's really clear. You have to quote here if there's been an offer there, if it's obvious that the market's there, or if the seller's there. But you can quote here if this is where the market's at, there's been no offers, and the seller has an open mind. Last bit of information. This is what you're now going to see in the Melbourne market for quite some time. It's called volatility. You're going to see big boom auctions, you're going to see huge pass-ins, you're going to see big boom offers, huge pass-ins, and you can already see it in today's results. There's plenty up here, and there's still a number down here. Bid demand is 1.5, which has been a little bit of an increase, but the reason that it's not going through the roof is because there's still a lot of properties down here where sellers have expectations here and buyers are here, and this is where you end up. The results that come from here is where sellers have expectations here, buyers possibly have expectations here, and then that pushes it. So there's the two ways: volcanoes or go down, bring a buyer back up. This is what you're going to see more and more of in a rising Melbourne market. I'm Mel James, James Buy Sell. Thank you for listening.